Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got into the Roundup post for you guys this month, coming into April. These are albums I've just been listening to for the past few weeks, and the intention here is to kind of just give you a brief overview of these albums. Maybe you want to go out and check them out on your own. But for now, let's go ahead and get started with Mononeon's Put on Earth for You. Now, this isn't the proper follow-up to last year's Superman, which I just posted on last week. And if you want to know more about Mononeon, check out that post, because he's a very interesting character. Has a lot to talk about. It's way beyond the scope of just this little brief overview. But this album is more along the lines of what Mononeon normally does. It is more of a self-produced effort than Superman was. And as such, it doesn't quite have the same commercial appeal, I think, that Superman had. It's a little bit more on the quirky side, shows a little bit more of his carefree compositional style.
Put on earth for you to give you flowers in a world full of I was put on earth for you to hold your hand while you're looking at the moon. I was put on earth for you to make you laugh when you feel sad. I was put on earth.
Although this album doesn't probably have the commercial appeal that Superman had, I still feel like some of the lessons that he learned from Superman are kind of showing up here, because even these quirkier and more opaque songs he has in this album still feel a bit more accessible than some of the other stuff that he has been doing previously. I see Mononeon as a guy he's always trying to evolve and trying to do the next thing. So it's always interesting to see how all the threads from his past have start to come together in new and different ways. And I think Put on Earth for You is a really good continuation of his ongoing project. Okay, next up I've got Tears for Fears, The Tipping Point. First album from Tears for Fears in 18 years, something like that. And a very interesting gestational period for this album. 2013 was actually when they started on trying to create something new. And they were sort of getting involved with collaborations with contemporary artists in sort of an attempt to update their sound. And most of those collaborations came up to nothing. The guys in Tears for Fears felt like it just didn't really sound like them. And a lot of the artistry that they really try to imbue into their albums wasn't really being reflected in that stuff. But a combination of those previous collaborations and some rewrites and a little bit more of a renewed interest in the band after a pretty successful tour in 2019 produced this Tipping Point album.
Raise your hand, bite your tongue. Conversation is over and done. We let 'em out, we let 'em in. Will you ever know when it's the tipping point, the tipping point? So who's that ghost knocking at my door?
Now, I'm a huge fan of Songs from the Big Chair. It was kind of formative for me in a time when I didn't really realize that it was being formative. But my love for that album kind of inhibited my ability to get into their other albums, like Seeds of Love and these albums that are considered classic Tears for Fears albums. I never really quite connected with as much because they're very clean and they're very sanitary and they're very, in some ways, almost overthought, but there's so much thought that goes into them, you had to respect the end product. And I think The Tipping Point kind of falls in that category. Some breathtaking musical moments and some breathtaking lyrical revelations that we have during the course of the album. But again, at the same time, it starts to feel like it's very clean and the sort of the grit that exemplified the earliest work. It just doesn't feel like it's there in the same way. So it's kind of veers into almost adult contemporary to a degree, but I really do also respect the amount of integrity and the amount of honesty that they poured into this recording, because that comes through. Okay, next up I got Tom McGuire and the Brassholes, their self-titled debut album. It's a Glasgow-based soul funk rock project, and I'm a person who's had a lot of experience with kind of this style of music. Especially in the mid-90s, I was playing around North Texas, and a lot of bands got into this style. And I heard a lot of great bands in this style, and a lot of not-so-great bands in this style. And so I'm kind of picky about funk rock and that genre of music in general. But I got to say that Tom McGuire and the Brassholes do it right overall. Great playing, especially from the horns. I'm really sort of in this phase where I'm getting a lot of happens to be a lot of trombone solos and stuff. Also, a little bit deeper and more reflective lyrics, I think, on this album than a lot of other albums in this style. Not a whole lot about here just kind of being goofy or whatever, but soul-searching ideas about mortality and life and that sort of thing. But they're also not above, from time to time, dipping into a little bit more accessible concepts with maybe pop culture references.
Lots of people talking, few of them know. You gotta have a tag if you wanna make that dough. Woo! Who's that sitting over there? Woo! Sporting that big underwear. Woo! Most glorious platinum hair. All you young pretenders, well, you best beware.
One of my favorite ways to frame this album is to think of it kind of like, what if Jack Black sung lead for Tower of Power? You know, the lead singer, Tom McGuire, has that kind of, I think, charisma. He's very invested in the style and really, really loves the music that he's playing. And I think that comes through in this album as well. So this is one that I didn't really think that would amount to much to me in the big picture, but I've listened to it again and again and really come to enjoy it. Okay, next up I've got Wolf Alice's Blue Weekend. First introduced to Blue Alice 3 or 4 years ago. A friend of mine texted me out of the blue. They were at South by Southwest and said this was a band to check out and to follow. Of course, I took that to heart and I kind of put them on my radar. Blue Weekend sort of came up with a lot of really good recommendations last year, so I put it on my wish list, and here we are with it. And there's a lot I love about Wolf Alice. I really love the scope of the album, especially production-wise. Some people might complain about the broader aspects of its production, but I really enjoyed the big production on this album.
Would we ever have tied the knot? Well, how long is a piece of string? And for everything that ends, something else must begin. No hard feelings, honey, and we both will take the win.
Wonderful melodies on this album and a lot of great songwriting. The issue that I see, that I kind of have with this album right now, though, is that, you know, when you have a band that likes to employ different styles, that can be a plus or a minus. So you have to be careful about how you navigate a variety of styles. It's got to all kind of sound like it comes from one band. And in this case, like, you'll have a chorus that sounds like it's from Kate Bush, and then like a verse that sounds like it's from Fiona Apple. You know, and these things go back and forth, and they don't always feel like they mesh into a cohesive whole. It's possible to have a punk rock song right alongside almost like a folk ballad, but you have to be cognizant to think about how those things meld together. And I'm not sure that in the big picture that happens on this album overall, but song for song, there's a lot of really great things that happen on Blue Weekend. Okay, next up I got Nerija's Blume. Earlier this year, I started to kind of contemplate the idea that maybe I just didn't really like jazz so much anymore. You know, I had a really great opportunity to push Art Blakey through last year into my top 20. Didn't quite happen. I got a really great disc earlier this year from the Eastman Jazz Ensemble, big band disc, and I had problems with some of the performances on that one. So maybe I felt like I was pulling away from jazz. Well, Blume has taken that fear and just knocked it into little bitty pieces, because from the moment that I put this album on, I really, really enjoyed it from beginning to end, all the tracks on this one. This is a UK-based jazz group, kind of a collective, oddly mostly female-led. You know, not that women can't play jazz, you just don't see it as often. And this group, is the majority of the players are women, playing fantastic solos with great compositions. Although this is not really a straight-ahead classic jazz album, it's not swing style or anything like that, it certainly is in the jazz idiom. It's clearly a jazz album. The amount of soloing that happens on it and the vocabulary that the soloists use definitely are pin it to that heritage. And I really do also really love the sounds in this album. The drumming particularly, very dry, very dry snare in this album, and guitar that almost kind of bleeds over into some post-rock sounds, very kind of overdriven, but still kind of clean sounds on it. Wonderful, wonderful solos. I can't say enough about the soloing on this album. Really great one that has rekindled my interest in what's happening in contemporary jazz. And finally, Marillion's most recent album, An Hour After It's Dark. Marillion has released up-teen million albums at this point. I was a really big fan of the Fish era of Marillion, but I've always supported them even after Steve Hogarth took over. I will always give Marillion a chance on any of their albums. But I also tend to believe critics whenever I read things about Marillion, kind of like I would with Weezer, I think Marillion with Steve Hogarth has the ability to make great albums. But I don't think they always do. Sometimes they have albums that feel a little bit less inspired than others. They're never really offensively bad or anything like that, but certainly like you get through to the end of the album but nothing really sticks. It's an enjoyable experience, but when you get to the end where you have to ask yourself, like, even though it's progressive rock, there still has to be a component of songwriting in it. And I feel like Marillion often does that, but not always.
They test me once a year. They test me once a year. You have to care. You have to care. You have to care. You have to care.
As you probably have guessed, I think that this is a pretty good Marillion album. I don't find anything superficially wrong with it, but it doesn't really grab my attention. It does, to a certain degree, feel like it's very kind of monochromatic, which for Marillion is kind of a big deal. It all just sounds like the big, mid-tempo Marillion sounds. Mark Kelly, who's responsible for a lot of the really shining points of this album, also kind of takes over acoustically sometimes. And the keyboard sounds feel like they overbalance almost everything else. They provide great sounds and great textures, but it feels like sometimes the guitar is lost, sometimes I feel like the bass is lost, even vocals sometimes are lost. And I also have the sense that Steve Hogarth, he's starting to get the rut to a degree that John Anderson fell into at a certain point, where his voice sounds great. He's got a very unique and distinctive voice, to the point where he could sing almost anything he wants to, and it would sell to a certain extent. This album doesn't have as many identifiable melodies in the vocals as I'd like to see, which is part of the reason why I think things aren't quite so memorable. But I do see that as Steve Hogarth's voice is aged, he's using a broader variety of timbres in his voice. And the timbral colors that he uses in his voice in this album are one of the things, actually, I think that's very successful about it. So despite not having very identifiable melodies, it definitely has the sense of adding to and taking away from the tension and release of these songs through the different qualities of his very unique voice. And that's all I got for you guys this week. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and then share it out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I'll be putting tracks up from these various albums on my 2022 playlist. Also, there's going to be eliminations going on. We're in Tier 2 eliminations. We're going through albums that have already been through a series of eliminations and getting into the monthly listening roundup recordings that we're presenting in these posts. So please check that out if you have the opportunity. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.